Okay, can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Sonali Menezes, and I'm the Programming and Exhibition Specialist at the Workers Arts and Heritage Center. For those of you who are unfamiliar with WAC, we are a community museum located in Hamilton, Ontario. And we are dedicated to bringing together and celebrating all working people, paid and unpaid, through art, history, and culture. Today's launch is also presented with Goose Lane Editions, the Afro-Canadian Caribbean Association, and King West Books. I'm going to start the afternoon with a land acknowledgement. As a first step in redirecting my personal relationship and WAC's relationship with the land and the land's original inhabitants. I'm a second-generation immigrant with roots originating in Goa, India. As a settler, I have benefited from the ongoing process of colonization of the land we know today as Canada. As a museum with a physical location that is predominantly settler-led, we know our organization has also benefited from these processes. As an organization, we are grateful for the land our building sits on, the backyard we're able to enjoy, and the garden our community cultivates during the growing season. I am personally grateful for the black raspberries at the back of our yard, which are quite delicious. The land that our building inhabits is the ancestral territory of the Wendat and Neutrals, and later became the territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg, who all lived here long before the city we know as Hamilton was established. We are part of the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequently, other Indigenous nations and peoples have been invited into this treaty of peace, friendship, and respect. As an organization, we are committed to forging meaningful relationships with Indigenous communities, artists, and cultural organizations to facilitate and make visible within the scope of our mandate the histories and cultures of the people that lived here before colonial settlement. We hope to thoughtfully reposition our view of the land away from being a resource and towards the relational. We have gratitude for the land protectors, including those closest to WAC at 1492 Landback Lane, and stand in solidarity with them and Indigenous movements for sovereignty and liberation. As we enter this conversation around Andrew's new book, we are also aware of the ways that colonialism and slavery are intimately tied. We know that the transatlantic slave trade was fueled by the colonization of Africa. We also know that enslaved labor was used by settlers here on stolen land, and that this legacy persists. Andrew's book illuminates Canada's violent roots, also as a way of repositioning our relationship to the land. Before I hand things over to Ben at Goose Lane Editions, I'd like to highlight that Andrew is also curating exhibitions in our main and community galleries in connection to this book and Sophia Berthen, which will start on May 11th. These exhibitions have created space for us to focus on these themes this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at the museum. Stay informed on our programming by visiting our website, social channels, and sign up for our newsletter. As a reminder for today, as an organization, WAC strives to live our values of solidarity, equity, inclusion, and dignity, and this virtual format is no exception. Please bear that in mind as we share this virtual space. Please keep your mics muted for the duration of the event, no matter how tempting it is to unmute yourself to speak. There will be a Q&A with Andrew and Taliba at the end of the event. And if you have any questions at any point, please use the chat function and the speakers will be sure to try and answer your questions at the end. I'm going to hand things over to Ben. Before I do that, Florencia, can I ask you to stop sharing your screen? And then, perfect. And I'm just going to go to speaker view. And Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sonali. Very happy we got to see your smiling face before you wrapped things up there. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ben Burnett, Publicity Manager for Goose Lane Editions. And I wanted to thank everybody, first of all, for joining us today for the launch of It Was Dark There All the Time, Sophia Berthen and the Legacy of Slavery in Canada. Thank you to Sonali again and the team at WAC for all of their help with this event and their work on the exhibition with Andrew. We're all very excited to see what comes out of that work later this spring. On behalf of Goose Lane, I also really want to extend congratulations to Andrew on the publication of this landmark title. Our team is just so grateful to have been a part of this project. And knowing the amount of time and the years that have gone into making this book, and I think it's really interesting to mention just how many of the topics Andrew touches on that have entered the public discourse in that time. Things like the importance of truly examining Canada's history and processing the racism that's taken for granted or ignored when we talk about Canadian Confederation, and the question of legacy and which historical figures we choose to honor. These are topics that are just commonplace now, but Andrew's been working on this book for so long, and I'm once again just so grateful to see it be released finally. Before we get going, I also want to thank Dave at King West in Hamilton and remind everyone who's joining us from Hamilton, Andrew will be signing copies of the book at the store on King Street tomorrow. He'll be there tomorrow noon to 4, so drop in anytime tomorrow afternoon. There's a rumor that he'll be signing any book going around, but I want to make sure that you're all picking up copies of Andrew's book if you're going to see it and grab a signature from him. We're always pleased to partner with independent bookstores like King West, and it was doubly important for this event because Andrew did so much of the writing for the book at King West. Buying from Dave will also give you a chance to get a special copy of the book before the official publication day next week. You can also order it off the King West website at kingwestbooks.com. And there is a link, which is in the chat. I'll make sure to link it again before we finish up for today. Now I'm pleased to introduce both our author and event host, starting with Taliba Howard, host of today's event. Taliba is the Youth Development Program Coordinator for the Afro-Canadian Caribbean Association of Hamilton. Taliba originally hails from Jamaica. She moved to Virginia to study, receiving a bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology, where Taliba studied cognitive neuroscience and race-based policy. Taliba collaborated with the Caribbean Students Association to develop inclusive initiatives through an anti-racist lens, and her work continues to push these initiatives through research. Joining Taliba, of course, is artist, activist, archivist, author, multi-hyphenate Andrew Hunter. Andrew was born in Hamilton and graduated from NSCAD University in Nova Scotia. He's held curatorial positions across Canada, including at the Vancouver Art Gallery and the Art Gallery of Hamilton. He's taught at the Ontario College of Art and Design University and the University of Waterloo, and he's lectured on curatorial practice across Canada, the United States, England, China, and Croatia. And with that, I'll throw things over to Taliba and Andrew.
Thank you, Ben. And thanks everybody for joining today under these circumstances. Thank you, Taliba, for being here.
Thank you.
It's a real thrill, to have to share the stage and the book with somebody, because the book has always been about spreading conversation and dialogue. And so I won't go on too long about that. We're going to talk about it. But thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. So before, I'm going to read for a little bit, but I wanted to start by saying hi, Mom. My mom and I live together, and hopefully my mom is, with the help of Lisa, seeing this on Zoom. And so just wanted to shout out to my mom, who has been an amazing supporter and believer in me for a long time. And also that I hope my dog Zag is behaving. I also wanted to acknowledge my father, who passed away last year, who was a huge influence on me, both my parents. Great lover of history, very inquisitive person. Sadly, the last year when my father was ill, he couldn't read as much as he really liked to. And but I was able to read from the later versions of the book to Dad and talk about it a lot. So as much as I would love it if he was here for many reasons, I know we did get to connect about this book, and that means a great deal. So I'm going to read, and what I've decided to do is, rather than pick a chapter and read, I'm reading fragments because the book is multi-layered, and so I want to give people a sense of the book itself and how it's written, and the tone and the voice and the many voices. And I'm going to begin. At times, I'm going to read the words of Sophia Berthen, and in the book, her complete interview, which the book is based out of is completely reproduced in the book. So I'm going to begin. This is Sophia speaking in her interview from 1855. My parents were slaves in New York State. My master's sons-in-laws, Daniel Outwaters and Simon Knox, came into the garden where my sister and I were playing among the currant bushes, tied their handkerchiefs over our mouths, carried us to a vessel, put us in a hold, and sailed up the river. I know not how far nor how long. It was dark there all the time. This is from chapter 1, What's in a Name? She carries 3 names. The first, Sophia, is common. Its Christian meaning is divine wisdom. To Muslims, it means beautiful. Let's think of her in these dignified terms. Her last name, Puli, she took from the man she married in freedom. Puli refers to a pond or a pool of water that is located next to a ley, an area of pasture or grassland. A ley can also refer to a ley line, a supposed straight line connecting 3 or more prehistoric or ancient sites, sometimes regarded as the line of a former track, and associated by some with lines of energy and other paranormal phenomena. That definition comes from the Oxford English Dictionary. Puli is riparian, as in fed by or living near the banks of a river. Wise and beautiful, she sits by the water at the edge of a field. I am searching for the ley lines which still pulse, linking her across time and space to this moment. It is her maiden name, her enslaved name, Berthin, that carries the most weight and casts the longest shadow. Berthin is an archaic English word that will become burden, the TH morphing into a single D. It now means a physical thing one carries or a psychological weight of, say, anxiety, trauma, or depression that can or will be passed on to others, becoming a responsibility, quote, the burden of proof, and may be a curse lingering in the past and shading the future. But originally, it was a very specific nautical term, referring to a ship's measure or capacity. A ship's tons burthen defined the very weight and quantity of what it could hold and convey, its maximum cargo, as it was used in the following text from a fugitive slave advertisement. Quote, run away about 10 o'clock Thursday last from John Cannon, New York City. 3 Negroes with a sloop belonging to said Cannon, burthen about 35 tons. Whoever takes up and returns said Negro men and the sloop shall receive 20 pounds and all reasonable charges from John Cannon, end quote. This is from the New York Gazette, 1732. The average burthen of ships plying the Middle Passage was much more than 35 tons. The 125-foot ship Diamond, for example, launched in 1798 by Patrick Beatson and Company, with construction overseen by Henry Baldwin, was the first large cargo vessel built in Quebec since the British ended French rule of the colony in 1763. Upon changing ownership in 1801 to Perry and Company of London, it was retrofitted, its hull sheathed with copper and the cargo hold divided with a second deck, its burthen reduced from over 500 to 443 tons. Under Captain James Clark, the Diamond sailed from London to West Africa and then made 2 known deliveries of enslaved Africans to the West Indies. In 1802, 391 persons were transported to Trinidad. In 1803, 389 persons were transported to Cuba. 44 people died on each of the 2 voyages. Diamond's time working the Middle Passage was brief. It was refitted for whaling in 1804. In the British Empire, an act for the abolition of the slave trade, passed in 1807, ended the international trade and made it illegal for British vessels to continue shipping human cargo across the Atlantic. But this did not change Sophia's enslaved status, as the sale of enslaved people within specific colonies was not stopped. Britain also continued to trade and manufacture materials and products and otherwise profit from a global economy dependent on enslaved labor. The term burthen has echoes in a ship's berth, a place to moor a ship and unload its cargo. If it's a living cargo, then the berth signifies a landing where the next stage of the journey begins. and the space within the ship where a person sleeps. Sophia carried this term as part of her name, as did her parents, Dinah and Oliver, whose first names are mentioned in her interview, and her sister, who remains otherwise unnamed in the historical record. But where did this name come from? Who burdened them with a name pointing to a past filled with journeys in the holds of various vessels in bondage? How far distant in Sophia's ancestry is the Middle Passage that forced 12 to 15 million persons into migration across the Atlantic, of whom nearly 2 million perished and were in effect murdered? Did previous generations of her family come directly to the coast of North America, or did their journey happen in stages via the Caribbean or South America, or maybe with stopovers south of New York, around the Gulf of Mexico, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, the shores of Chesapeake Bay? How long were the Berthans and their ancestors trapped in the triangle trade of Europe to Africa to the Americas? Do their roots go back to the early 1600s, when the Dutch West India Company imported Africans to New Amsterdam, later renamed New York City, or to the first slave auction held there in 1655? Dear Sophia, your interview is a puzzle, a complex weaving of fragments. At times, it seems you were several ages at once, that between your birth in Fishkill and passage out of slavery decades later, you move through time fluidly and you are channeling the memories of more than one person. At times, you seem too old and then too young, but then you give us much to align and triangulate, markers to navigate from, names, relationships, dates, places. You have divine connections, you who are named for divine wisdom. From the eve of the American Revolution in the mid-1770s, you witnessed Governor John Graves Simcoe's 1793, an act against slavery, and then an act for the abolition of the slave trade in Britain and the act prohibiting importation of slaves in the United States, both 1807. The War of 1812 that ran through 1815, the British Slavery Abolition Act passed in 1833, enacted in 1834, and the United States Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Did you live to see the American Civil War break out in 1861 and witness the Great Emancipation in 1863 at war's end? Were you present at the birth of Canada in 1867? And if so, where were you? Did you read the words of formerly enslaved persons, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, William Wells Brown, and many others? Were you given the opportunity to learn to read? Did you hear Reverend Samuel Ringgold Ward, the prominent Black freeman from the United States, who was an executive officer of the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada, which supported Benjamin Drew's book? Did you ever encounter Reverend Josiah Henson? How often, if ever, did you frequent the African Methodist, British Methodist Episcopal Church in the Queensbush? Did you live to see the dissolution of the community of over 1,000 Black settlers where Drew encountered you when they were pushed off the land they'd cleared, all while Canada was, as you said, filling up with white people? I'm just taking a sip. This is from chapter 2 on whiteness. I am a white man. I realize that many BIPOC readers do not need to hear another white man's words, particularly words shaped by the life of a Black woman who lived enslaved in Canada, that draw on the writings and cultural expressions of BIPOC voices. I know that there will also be white people who don't want to hear the critique of whiteness that runs through this story. To BIPOC individuals and communities, I hope that you will take up this narrative and come to see it as a valuable contribution. To white people, particularly Canadians, you need to read this or any book that discomforts us in trying to get beyond feel-good narratives of our histories. We are implicated. We cannot continue in innocence or feigned ignorance of a damning legacy that we continue to benefit from and defines our place in the world. We need to accept a past that is shaped and that we continue to reshape in the present. As writer James Baldwin cautioned, quote, "An invented past can never be used. It cracks and crumbles under the pressures of life like clay in the season of drought," end quote. White as a category of race is, like race or gender, subjective. The skin privilege of whiteness, the privileges associated with being white, is a fact. It exists. It intersects with the fact of racism and other facts like transphobia, homophobia, and misogyny. These all exist and intersect. Whiteness and racism, like transphobia, homophobia, and misogyny, are facts that intersect. Quote, race is an idea, not a fact, end quote, American historian and artist Nell Irwin Painter declares in The History of White People. Quote, and its questions demand answers from the conceptual rather than the factual realm, end quote. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, scholar Ibram X. Kendi declares that, quote, race is fundamentally a power construct of blended difference that lives socially. He goes on, quote, race creates new forms of power, the power to categorize and judge, elevate and downgrade, include, exclude. Race makers use that power to process distinct individuals, ethnicities, and nationalities into monolithic races. Kendi ties the idea of race directly to transatlantic chattel slavery. Quote, the first global power to construct race happened to be the first racist power and the first exclusive slave trader of the constructed race of African people. He is referring to the 15th century Prince Henry the Navigator, Dom Henrique of Portugal, Duke of Viseu. Those of us who are white often try not to identify as such, to claim to not, quote, see race. We point out that there is no scientific evidence to support the division of humanity into invented categories based on skin color. Dismissing uncritical race theory does not nullify racism or dissolve whiteness as a fully functioning worlding that offers, quote, the privilege of being inherently normal, standard, and legal, end quote. That's again Kendi. Those who deny their whiteness in these ways also deny the lived realities of Blackness, denying identity, community, and agency to all held outside of the policed boundaries of whiteness. In Canada, Black and Indigenous peoples continue to be criminalized and stigmatized. In Policing Black Lives, Robin Maynard accurately defines Canada as a country that, quote, in the eyes of many of its citizens, as well as those living elsewhere, is imagined as a beacon of diversity, end quote, a resilient fiction contradicted by, quote, an untold story of Black subjection in Canada. Maynard adds that, quote, Black lives in Canada have been exposed to a structural violence that has been tacitly or explicitly condoned. The dominant ideas about Canada, multicultural, diverse, free of racism, I was raised on have long been set in opposition to ideas about the United States, the latter a melting pot of overtly coerced assimilation, a nation defined by the exclusion and incarceration of those not considered, quote, normal, standard, and legal, end quote, citizens. The distinction between the nations, however, is really just a methodology. Canada's preferred image of racial tolerance and innocence regarding slavery has created more challenging barriers that sustain a nation where a discernible lack of awareness surrounding the widespread anti-Blackness, as Maynard states in Policing Black Lives, continues to hide in plain sight, obscure and commitment to liberalism, multiculturalism, and equality. In following Sophia, I am also necessarily writing of whiteness and of erasure, carrying an inheritance of flawed memories weighed down by the absence and the spirit of a fellow human being nearly lost, intentionally obscured, extirpated. In trying to find her, I inevitably find whiteness, because whiteness has documented itself and not her. I crossed the troubled paths of too many 19th century white abolitionists who carried white supremacist and racist ideas out of emancipation, who wanted slavery to end, but Black people sent back to Africa. I encountered too many voices, white voices, maintaining privilege. I find whiteness too often surfacing in my own language. I'm going to read one short part from the book, because I want to get into talking with you. So I'd identified a couple parts, but I think I want to read this passage, which comes from chapter 10, and then we came by land. And the titles of the book, a lot of the titles of the chapters, like the title of the book, come from Sophia's words. And in other parts, I write to Sophia. So this is brief. Chapter 10, and then we came by land. Dear Sophia, it must have been brutal to make that journey by land, struggling along a rugged footpath, even given the possibility of horses or ox cart aiding the journey. You were children. What time of year was it? What kind of weather? Did you know how far you were going to travel? From Albany to Niagara is nearly 500 kilometers. It would take weeks, if not well over a month. I imagine you being strong, that you had the stamina to keep going. Yet I am certain the white men were not above physical coercion to make you keep up the pace. What did you know of the landscape or the people you encountered? Focused on surviving and no doubt traumatized by being taken from your parents who are growing far distant, I doubt you took in the richness of your surroundings. The wilderness that was threatening and frightening to them nonetheless suggested great opportunities for exploitation to the white men. To watch, observe, catalog, and map all they could possess and those they could dispossess. In the same pages of the New York Gazette, featuring the notices for the fugitive slave Tom from 1755 through 1756, an advertisement appeared for Mark Catesby's The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands, 1754. An ideal addition to the library of any colonial planter or investor who wished to remain in Britain, it described the fertile lands awaiting development and extraction. These details of land for the taking was the appeal and direct link to colonization of such natural history books. Much of what Catesby revealed would be harvested, eradicated, and reduced as building material and fuel, and to make way for the labor-intensive cultivation of introduced plants and animals. There is no mention of whose lands these are, and little of who will undertake the labor. Dear Sophia, a century after Catesby, John James Audubon produced his monumental Birds of America. A black walnut tree is the setting for his common crow, the bird staring mischievously at us with one shiny black eye. It appears to be smiling, ready to steal the eggs from a hummingbird's nest. I wonder if, progressing across New York, you were able to take in the vast menagerie of birds to register their songs and calls in the dense forests where our war parties had and would pass, where armies of conquest seeking revenge marched, and where refugees fled west to Fort Niagara. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much. So Taliba is going to start by doing a bit of reading.
Yeah.
And so Sonali, can you put that image on the screen of the painting that Taliba is going to be reading about?
So, hi everyone. So I'll be reading two separate passages from this work. Both passages are sections of the book to which I felt the most connected, for two similar reasons. I think it had a lot to do with my experiences, my understanding of my ancestry, as well as just feelings that I had whilst reading these passages. I'll start off with something from chapter 10 as well, and then we came by land, regarding a painting that Andrew saw at the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, New York. The portrait hangs before me on a curving wall in the central stairwell. Her gaze is direct. A strong light reflects off her smooth skin and heightens the intensity of the whiteness of the capelet, draped over the shoulders of the puff sleeves of her high-waisted yellow dress. This modest portrait is now titled simply Portrait of a Child. It was formerly titled Black Child and was painted by the Baltimore artist Philip Thomas Coke Tilliard. Placed high up on the wall, the portrait is a distant image when I view it, and the information on the label is evasive, never addressing the basic omission. What was her name? How hard would that have been for the artist to inscribe on the back, on the stretcher, or the minimal gold frame? Quote, perhaps a young girl, this honest, compassionate representation of an anonymous African-American child is unusual for an early 19th century white artist, unquote. The permanent collection label states, quote, was the well-dressed child a favored slave, the child of a free African-American family, or the charge of a white abolitionist family? The child's gender, class, and social position remain uncertain, unquote. To call this portrait, quote, honest, compassionate representation, unquote, is pure projection and far too subjective an opinion to be offered in the anonymous, authoritative voice of the institution. I want to know who the author of this label is and where they speak from to come to such a conclusion. There's no ambiguity about the gender suggested by the child's clothing. The sitter is presented as a young girl. The second passage is from chapter 18. To be innocent implies a genuine condition of not knowing or being naive, or lacking knowledge, experience of life, or good judgment, and willing to believe that people will always tell you the truth. Authentic innocence cannot be willed or performed. That is, the tainted innocent or willful ignorance, Baldwin and Hartman label the crime. Whiteness is wired to absorb all that it marginalizes into its mission, reducing others to artifacts, both things and narratives, and labor. Herman Melville's Ishmael wonders about the opulent houses of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Quote, whence came they, unquote. He answered in his own query, quote, one and all, they were harpooned and dragged up hither from the bottom of the sea, unquote. Like Frederick Douglass, who understood the true foundation of the United States and the admirable brutality, of chattel slavery and racism, Melville understood the true foundation of New Bedford in the immoral brutality of whaling, and by extension, the mechanisms of colonization and empire, including slavery in the United States. Quote, the history of capital, unquote. The scholar Christina Sharp reminds us. So I decided to read from these two passages, as I stated, because I felt the most connected to them, as well as because I felt that it would be a great transition into two questions, firstly, that I wanted to ask you. So the first being, how did you, in your research, in your journey towards writing the book and in your decision to write the book, how did you stay true to the history of Sophia's time?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because history, as various quotes in the book talk about, and I see, is it's from the present. It's like we write history now. It's not something we find. It's something that we kind of create. And so I guess I take a very layered approach. And so it includes archival research, it includes a lot of travel, and it includes a lot of talking to people and dialogue, because I find that, and I'm sure you too, that, so often what gets into the history books or into the archive is really only a fragment, and it is a reflection of whoever builds the archive or whoever writes. And so that's significant. I know lots of my colleagues and mentors who have been doing work around the history of slavery in Canada and the Americas talk a lot about that absence, right? The absence of Black voices and Black people and Indigenous people. And particularly in the case of people who are held enslaved, they're held as property. So you don't appear as persons, right? And so you don't appear in a lot of the kind of records that normally show up, or you're not being written about, or like the painting that you talked about, people aren't even named, right? And so you have to I was using this kind of analogy the other day, I think when I was talking to Stephanie, like I'm always looking outside at other models of how do we find things, how do we figure things out. So I'm not a physicist or an astrophysicist, but I'm interested in how that research is done. And so I was reading about like how do you identify things in space that you cannot see? Well, you look off to the side, you look around, you look for the effect of that mass or that weight on everything around it. Yeah. And so, you know, the bending of time, the bending of light. To me, that's an interesting analogy to trying to do this kind of work, is we're not going to find, we're very fortunate to find Sophia in the gift of her interview that she passes forward to us. And it is a demand to us today. It's not just a record or a historical record. And to see her briefly appear in the only other place is in a, you know, as a record of her being present in 1851 in the census. But so many of the lives of enslaved people of the African diaspora who were here, who were doing the work or doing the labor, they aren't recorded. They don't appear. So like Sophia interview, and then all she points to is like looking for the bending of light and so on. You can see that critical mass of a Black presence here if you just like look a little off to the side, right? So that's one thing. The other part is landscape. I really believe that Sophia is present. She is a presence here still. She has shaped this place. And if you just know where to go and where to look, you'll start to see those signs. And some of it is like, I use the like ley lines. There was a time where people really believed, like scientifically, that ley lines were true. But the fact that they're not scientific or whatever is kind of irrelevant in the end, because it's still something that people believed in a way to be in the world and to understand the world, right? And sometimes you go down a path that proves flawed, but it still gets you somewhere, right? You still went there for a reason and you will find things, right? So I believe that you cannot research and write about somebody like Sophia and try to write a traditional biography. It's not possible. And you have to go to the places that she went to and places and do it with other folks. Like Reagan Greenwich, who's going to join us later. Reagan came with me on those journeys, right? And you have to kind of believe in yourself that I'm here for a reason. Why am I here? I'm here because Sophia pointed me to this. Yeah. And then there's things that are going to surface here. And the things that are going to surface are going to be within the frame of the time and the place that she was present. Mm-hmm. And it's going to help me to understand that place and that space, right? I think it's always back again to this, that history is always a construction of the now and the present. So we're never going to get it right, but it is wrong one has to acknowledge that and not project back. And I think that happens way too much. The quote you were reading, where I was quoting from the label next to this little painting, it is so much projection and also a reflection of what somebody doesn't know. Mm-hmm. So they never suggest in the label after, right? They sort of suggest who might be, what's the relation, like who brought the young girl to be painted. They never suggest that they might be owned, which I talk about in the book. They don't say she may have been owned by the artist, right? She may have been, they don't even go there. It's got to be, it's this nice story about this, and then, or they were in the special care of an abolitionist, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the other piece where I think it gets complicated and messy, is how do we, like, there are all these layers and filters, right? The thing, just one more thing, because I don't want to ramble too much, and I want you to be part, is that experience of finding that painting. I went to the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, New York, because I was following the path that Sophia was taken on, right? So she's stolen when she's young with her sister. She ends up going up the river to Albany, and then she's taken by land, and they cross the Mohawk Valley. And so I was doing that journey. I popped down to Cooperstown. to do some research. And I went to the Fenimore because they had portraits. They have 2 portrait paintings of Tyndall Joseph Brand, who Sophia was purchased by at Niagara and brought to Canada by, or what we now call Canada, right? And I went in and I had seen a video, like an interview with the chief curator from years ago, talking about the museum and their renovations. And in the background was this painting, one of the famous paintings of Brand.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to go see it. So when I show up and I get into the museum and I'm there looking for Brand, why? Because I'm looking to follow Sophia. And what's on the wall? It's not the portrait of Brand, it's that painting of the unknown child, right? But the other thing about the moment is, like, I'm in this very prestigious, elite, very white institution that's very much defined and shaped by a very colonial white way of seeing and ordering the world, which art museums and art history is. And then I'm encountering a painting, and she is so far away. Like, it was absurd. The painting was like this big. Like, it's not very big. It was like across a rotunda and hung up on a wall. Like, so I couldn't even see it as a painting. I couldn't even get, and then the label is like over there and this big, and then those are the words. So I'm not sure if I'm directly answering the question, but it's like, I think it's like to try and take on this story of Sophia. I did not have a clear plan in the beginning. And my editors can say, like, no, he clearly didn't. He did not have a plan, right? And because I don't think I could, right? Like, I think it was essential in writing about her to constantly be just journeying. And as James Baldwin, we were talking about, James Baldwin said, a journey is called a journey because you have no idea where it's going to take you. And that was that. So, yeah, I mean, I think isn't a single way, and I'll just repeat again, to write about history is done from here, but always trying to keep yourself from projecting too much, right? Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. I wanted to expand on that particular question just a little bit. Throughout your journey on writing this book, historically speaking, what did you find were some of the differences between this particular topic in the United States and Canada? And what were some of the, I guess, unifying factors?
I think what I'll do, in a way, it's like, I think it parallels with conversations that I've had with people like yourself and others who talk about the experience of anti-Black racism, right? In that, if you're in the United States, like, it's obvious. Historically, it's been obvious. You know where you stand, sadly, and you know what the rules are. For so many people in Canada, there's this, it's a void. It's like, it's there, but I can't quite put my finger on it. You don't really know. It's almost like, it can be almost more difficult because there's this kind of a smiley face denial, right? Of, oh no, right? And so I think the difference, again, is like, there is clearly a deep understanding in the United States, in at least to do with the former southern parts, the Confederacy, where slavery stayed on the longest, right? That there's a clear idea that happened, that existed, right? And people have a position on that. It's pretty hard to deny the existence of that in the South. The parallel to Canada is in the North, in the northern United States, there is an equal denial of the history of slavery in the North, as in Canada. And one of the things I try to get at in the book, particularly in the time of Sophia's life, particularly the early part, is, you know, we're talking about in that time between the American Revolution and the War of 1812. And that period, the border is very fluid. These, like, you know, New England, New York, the Northeast of the United States, and what becomes Canada are not separate. Like, they sort of are, like, they start to become, but they're not. The people who come and settle here, the people like the Beasley family, the Durans, others, like, they come here from the Northeastern. They come like, some of them, in the case like the Beasleys, came from Albany, right? Like, people came here from the very place that Sophia came from. The ideas and values and economic systems and everything that was being developed in that part just spreads north here, right? So, and then you get this denial, because we were saying earlier about there's this sense that, oh, Boston was a really great place, the abolitionists and all that. So that history, that interpretation makes people think that Boston today is not racist because of the history. So I would say, like, the first half, the separation, the difference is that there's a lot more focus on the history, the latter phase of slavery in the United States and plantation slavery and so on, like, and then the Underground Railroad, and that gives us a great story and People in the North story. But then it's that erasure of, like, the deep, long history, as Dr. Charmaine Nelson, who quoted in the book, says, like, people love to talk about the Underground Railroad in the North in Canada, but don't want to talk about the over 2 centuries of slavery. And the role of slavery as the economic foundation of the British Empire.
And I think also there's the tendency to have this kind of comparative definition of what racism is and what slavery was, as it relates to Canada, saying, okay, this portion of the United States, it was worse, so that's what we should focus on, instead of focusing on what our history of Canadians is, and our treatment of particular minority or equity-seeking groups. So I definitely echo that idea.
We were talking, I want to do something that I don't want to lose sight of. I want to include a contribution from Chantal Gibson, and we're going to come to that in a sec. It's a video. And then we're going to invite Reagan to join us. But just before that, I wanted to comment. There's a very good program that comes out called The Dig podcast. The Dig, there's 4 episodes about capitalism and slavery. And I want to point that out to people. You should go look it up. It's not hard to find, listen to it, because it really gets into what you're talking about, right? This, and what you're pointing to, this idea that somehow slavery in the South was really, really bad. And while there might have been some slavery in the North and so on, but it wasn't that bad. There weren't as many. There's also, like, slavery is slavery, right? And so I encourage people to listen to those, particularly the first episode talking about slavery in Rhode Island, and really goes deep into saying, like, everybody who was in these communities was involved in slavery. Some people owned 1 person, some people owned 3. Everybody invested in the slave ships, right? Because just like whaling that comes, nobody invested all their money 100% in a slave thing. You needed all these people because it was risky. So everybody was making money. The other thing that's really important that comes up in that series is, in the North, people have to realize that enslaved persons were highly skilled, usually more skilled and more knowledgeable than the white settlers coming in. So white settlers could not have lived or survived. This is true of the Hats, who come here to Hamilton Dundas, who Samuel Hatt, who purchased Sophia, right? They didn't know how to build a mill. They didn't know how to run a mill. And there weren't white folks coming from Europe who had that experience. Who had the experience? It's the highly skilled people who are brought up enslaved or as servants, quote, who have that knowledge, right? So this history that gets told here about the Hats built these mills, and no, they didn't. Somebody else built the mills, right? And it was likely many people who had come out, were either free now or had come out of slavery. The other part that's important about that is, imagine, this goes back to the horror of it. You're an enslaved person, you work, you're owned by a carpenter or whatever. You, over your life, will build up all of this skill and knowledge and become highly experienced, but you will never get to have your own business. You probably aren't able to live with your family. And imagine what it's like to be a business person who owns somebody who is so highly skilled who will never become competition. And that's really important, right? So we got to keep all of those things in mind. Like, Sophia never experienced true freedom, even though she was, quote, free at some point. So what I want to do here is just to circle back a bit. And you had brought up that painting and looking at this work. And we've also talked about history and history from the present. Chantal Gibson, who's a scholar, artist, who was going to join us live, but can't. Why? Because she has her own talk in Vancouver today at the same time. I've reproduced in the book a poem that she wrote based on a painting of an unknown woman that's hanging at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And Chantal, who was an amazing supporter and mentor on this book, has sent a short video reading that poem. And then we'll come back and invite Reagan in. And I know we're getting tight for time, so.
Hi, Andrew. Chantel here in Vancouver. Wouldn't you know, both of us, we would get a gig at the same time on the same day. So I just wanted to wish you congratulations on your book launch. And thanks for asking me to read Veronica. Here's Veronica. What's it like at the center of the AGO? Imagine being colored, drawn, and placed in a wooden frame. Another hung woman positioned just so in the middle of a landscape surrounded by rocks, lakes, mountains, and trees. McDonald to your right, Carmichael to your left. Imagine being forced to look, to spend every unblinking moment of an 8-day week staring at a Lauren Harris landscape, a frozen wall of whiteness. When you know outside the glaciers are melting, the trees are falling one by one, and the Beaufort scale has shrugged and turned its back on September. Now, the winter legends are sold in the gift shop. T-shirts, handbags, journals, calendars, coffee cups, board games. Puzzling, isn't it? Makes you want to laugh a little knowing you've been placed here by kinder hands, to reconcile the past, to challenge the climate of the center. I'm a sign of the times. Still, no one knows my name. What's it like? It's like I'm the #1 answer to the question you haven't considered, the one you never thought to ask, the one staring you right in the face. Thanks, Andrew, and have a great day.
Are we back? If I can just say quickly, again, Chantel Gibson is a remarkably generous person. At one point in the writing of the book, I had a really giant, messy manuscript that needed a lot of work. And she read the whole thing and shared back like amazing and pushed. And that's what I've really appreciated in the experience of developing the book is the circle of people has grown. That's been really important. That I wanted to tell the story because I want Sophia's presence to be known, but I'm also trying to model something and engage and like grow the community of people doing the work, right? And share it and step back, right? Yeah. So, and that's what's so great about you being here today, because we've only met recently. So
very recently.
Yeah, very recently. So to have you step in at this moment is exactly the part of the momentum. And then we're going to invite Reagan in. For those of you, I just want to say Reagan has been a good friend for quite a number of years. We met when she was a student at Western. We traveled together when I was researching the book. We've done some work on Sophia together. Reagan Greenwich is 8th generation. Family came with Josiah Henson to settle the Dawn, and is now out in BC doing work around Indigenous language restoration. Super wonderful, generous person. So I'm glad Reagan's gonna join us, and she's going to read a little bit from she wrote the last part of the book. But anyways, Taliba.
Yeah, so I had a couple more questions to ask you. I think this one is one that I think a lot of people are processing at the moment, aside from just their own personal works. I think current events have caused folks to be questioning what is the social stance of Canada? So personally, in your journey towards writing the book, finishing the book, speaking with all of these people, how has it changed your informed opinion on Canada and your personal opinion, your experience?
I think I've been critical for a long time of the stories that Canada tells, this sort of surface narrative that people like to trot out and hide behind, and I don't think that'll be a surprise to people to hear me say that. And that has also been like looking in the mirror and challenging myself. And so I think, unfortunately, what I've found going through this process, traveling, talking to people, is, you know, and unfortunately that like a kind of reaffirmation of the lack of willingness on in many communities and so on to acknowledge the history. The number of times people kind of like come back with a kind of excuse or defense or whatever. I think one of the things that really worries and concerns me, and I'll keep this like I won't go on too long, is I think too much whiteness thinks it's doing good work. But what is actually happening is whiteness, I write about this in the book, whiteness is very good at absorbing everything it has historically marginalized into its project. And so too often what I'm seeing, and part of the reason I chose to step away from institutional work and just, you know, do my best to just be independent and to write as best I can, was this concern that all of this talk about decolonizing institutions and what was not being done by the people who needed to do it. You cannot simply like slightly rewrite, or I've often used this, like rewire what is at heart fundamentally a racist colonial institution, which, you know, much of the education and museum and art gallery work, like so much of the system, the city, policing, all that's still there. And so I think what's become deeper and deeper ingrained in me is a recognition of that and an acceptance that I'm part of that, and that there's a lot of work still to be done. It is not a workshop, right? Like understand, it's not I was asked recently by somebody, oh, would I come in and do a 1-hour lecture on decolonizing, right? And I was like, no, it's not for me to do, right? As Frantz Fanon said, like the colonizer cannot decolonize. It has to be a complete dismantling. I can't do that. All I can do is support and be an ally and use the tools that I've had the privilege of gaining to support and help, right? That's it. But I guess I'd like to be happy and whatever about it, but what I see often, and I've experienced in the past when I've done projects that challenge the dominant story, is people get pissed and they get upset or they engage and then immediately hit the reset button. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate that perspective.
Yeah, thank you.
Especially since, you know, given my personal experience, there's the tendency to not only erase our voices, but kind of start these projects where folks tend to be a little bit more upset that their contributions to this kind of systemic racism are being called out.
Yeah.
And less upset at what people of color, specifically, especially on Indigenous lands, people of Indigenous history have been experiencing.
Yeah, it's like people want gratitude, right? And I think let's invite Reagan in, by the way. But one of the great quotes I think that comes from Baldwin that might appear in the film I Am Not Your Negro is like, why are you asking me for gratitude for simply recognizing my existence, right? And it's like, yes, right? Like that is so powerful. I think it's like, but that feels like what's going on in all of these institutions, right? Same model, same leadership, same kind of wiring, and a desire for gratitude. How many people, I'm sure you know and I know, that were invited in and then had a horrible experience and got treated kind of badly, but also like were criticized for not being professional or not whatever, right?
Being nice enough about it.
Yeah. So I want to we're going to invite Reagan in, and Reagan has only first met Taliba today, and Stephanie Bass. So I'm thrilled that this connection is made. As I said before, I'd met Reagan when Reagan was a student. I was giving a talk at Western, and we started just kind of working together and getting to know each other. And hi, Reagan.
Hi, so nice to be able to join you guys.
Yeah, thank you. Do you mind just talking a bit about Sophia? I'm thinking particularly of, and it's in the book, there was a moment where we were sitting on the river in Lewiston, and I asked you to tell me what really resonated with you in Sophia's interview. And you talked about that. And can you just share a little bit of what you said at that time? And then I'm going to ask you to read the short piece you wrote that closes the book. and then we're going to move into a Q&A.
Yeah.
Okay, Reagan? Yeah.
Yeah, can do. I mean, I think there was a lot of great conversations that we were able to have along that trip. I know for me personally, there's so many things about Sophia's story that connected with me, just with her experience and kind of being able to feel what she felt in those places that she inhabited. For me personally, I know there was a strong connection with family in Sophia's story. I know that there's still much we don't know. Her interview was so short. It would have been lovely to have been able to hear more of her words. But even from what she was able to tell us in that interview, just thinking about her connection to her own family and how traumatizing it was for her to be ripped from not only her parents, but to go through that journey with her sister and then being lost along the way from each other. And in the way that she, in her own way, made a family with the people that she was living with and who held her in slavery here in Canada as well. I think it's easy to have strong emotions about how Sophia may have connected with the Brants and with the people that held her in slavery as well. But I think it's such a emotional and personal thing to find family wherever you can. And I think in a lot of ways, Sophia was able to do that, even in the way that she was maybe harmed by those people. I think that her desire to belong and to find family where she could is really strongly present in the way that she talks about living here in Canada, even though it may not have been the family she started with. She was able to find connections and build relations in any way she could, because that is such a human thing to want to do. And
Right.
I think that's something that I always thought about too, is the way that she carried her own sister's story with her, never knowing how that ended. But that she was someone that Sophia carried with her along and was able, even in her own small way, with the memories that she had of her sister, to have that story go on, even though we may not know what her sister's name was or the ending of her own story, that we can still see that there is a forgotten life there, in that through the process of history and the way that some stories are erased, that is one that we can look to and be mindful of and respectful of, and see that there is that hole there, that even though we're able to see Sophia's story and hear her words, there are so many others that were lost to time, and because of their circumstances, because of this colonial force, and because of the way in the nature of slavery, those people and their stories were lost along the way. So I'm just really grateful that we were able to hear even the echo of that voice through Sophia's interview.
So I wanted to, we're going to move into some Q&A, but first I wanted to ask you if you would read the short closing invocation from the book. When I was getting to the end, I felt like it was really important to have your voice kind of close things before people get to the point where they can read the entire interview with Sophia that appears in the appendix. So are you happy to read that?
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And then we're going to go to a Q&A.
Yeah, perfect. This is just a little bit I wrote for a bit of an epitaph for Sophia. It starts with, to Sophia, my grandmother, mother, sister, and friend. You have cleared a path for me to live in a land I claim as my home. You and I are no different, but for the time and space in which we walked. I thank you for the strength you had in your struggle towards a freedom you had to create for yourself. That strength has made my struggle a much lighter load. I adopt you now as forever part of my family and ancestry, a family that is bound not by ownership, but by honor and love. The darkness has lifted. Your family is free. Your story has been brought into the light. Rest well.
Thank you, Reagan.
Thank you, Reagan.
And can you try to stay with us for some of the questions, so we might invite you in. So yeah, at this point, Sonali, I guess we're ready to do some Q&A. Thank you so much, Taliba, so far. And you can ask questions of me, Taliba, Reagan, Sonali, whoever you like, and we'll do our best. And I also wanted to just add that, like, I'm fairly, as most people know, active on social media. If you know me through Instagram, Andy Tom Hunter, you can also reach out and send me some questions if you don't get things answered or whatever today. So Stephanie Bass, who's with us, operating the equipment on this stage in this beautiful empty movie theater, is going to kind of ask the questions for us, and we'll do our best.
So we've got a few questions and a comment that actually I think you'd be interested in commenting on yourself. So the first question we have is from Sarah Sudi. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
Hi, Sarah.
Question says, many people like to argue that slavery in fact lives on today. It exists in carceral institutions such as policing and prisons. Black and Indigenous people are carded, racially profiled, stalked, incarcerated, brutalized, and even murdered at the hands of police at disproportionate rates. Not to mention the horrible conditions that people who are incarcerated have to face on top of forced labor. How do you connect the threads between the abolition of slavery to the broader goal of abolition, which is to eliminate all carceral institutions that keep Black people and all people from being truly free?
Yeah.
That was from Sarah.
Okay. Do you want?
So I do want to kind of comment on that
And
a
I
little
will
bit.
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's very important to note that in most institutions wherein chattel slavery was the method of capital, the abolition of slavery just kind of blossomed into the creation and presence of the modern day criminal justice system and the modern day policing system. So nothing in a sense was abolished.
Yeah.
It was just reimagined, recreated, and reestablished.
Yeah.
Thank you for that comment.
Yeah, I think it's really important because the subtitle of the book is The Legacy of Slavery in Canada, but just its legacy. Canada is connected to the globe. I think one of the things I learned in the process of doing the book was I was certainly strongly aware that abolition wasn't a break, wasn't an end, that so many of the things that we see, whether it's in policing or the prison systems or anti-Black racism that denies people access to institutions, that just carried on. And I think abolition isn't over. It's like I often sometimes say, like, I think in the sense of John Brown, for example, of like, I still feel like I'm engaged in an abolitionist project. And it's because I don't think it ever came to an end. I think it just morphed. Whiteness, colonialism, capitalism is very good at morphing and adapting, right? Yeah. And so what we see, and I can see it from looking through the historic record and where people end up and what happens, that, yeah, like with kind of abolition, it just changes, the name changes. In Canada, Samuel Hatt, who owned Sophia, was also Justice of the Peace. He's signing people into indentured servitude. To be an indentured servant, it's like, and often the people are still like defined racially and by caste or class into that. Yeah. But as you were saying, yeah, it's just like, it's pretty seamless, right? Like people are suddenly, I think one of the big things for folks to remember, it's not just in the US around, 40 acres and a mule that was never delivered that Martin Luther King talked about at the end. And what that would mean in today's terms, that happened here. Many of the people who came north and settled here, the British who held people in slavery when slavery ends in the British Empire, they're given money, they're compensated. The people who are enslaved aren't compensated. The white folks are, and then they come here, and then they invest here, and they're investing in businesses and banking and land, and that continues to be carried down by future generations. But I think, as you say, like all of the, it just transforms. I mean, it's the horror of the justice system, right? The prison system. If you like the percentage, if you look at like in New York State, for example, it parallels here in Canada, where you're like the percentage of the Black population in New York is far smaller, just like in Canada, than the actual percentage of people who are held in prison, right? And what we do in the society of whiteness blames Blackness, as opposed to seeing that it's it's created this system
Yeah.
for itself, and the same with Indigenous. So they're not separate. Telling Sophia's story was really important to go a lot of places and to follow the threads forward and into the present. And I write and I talk to people about today through the lens of Sophia's perspective, because it isn't finished. If your story isn't told, if people have been erased, it's not over, right? So thanks, Sarah.
I have a comment that I thought you'd be interested in hearing and commenting on.
Sure.
From Shelley Falconer. You had said something, and then Shelley had responded, "So true, Andrew. Decolonizing is a journey. Museums are fundamentally colonial constructs. Decolonizing our institutions would require returning and removing most of our collections and models." And then Camille Turner responded, "True, Shelley, most institutions are not willing to do the work of reimagining what they could be and who they could and should serve."
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I thought that comment was something that you might want to comment on is because it sort of brings together your past experience as a curator to what we were talking about now with the resources that you had gathered for your book.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks both Shelley and Camille. Hi, Camille. I know it's Camille. Hi, Camille. Thank you for joining today. Yeah, I think, for myself, part of the reason I walked and stepped out of institutions was because I realized, it took a while, and I'm sorry it took so long, but again, a product of whiteness, sometimes you can't see. You think you can fix. Because, because you're the thing that's supporting you, that you're invested in. It's like hard to imagine living without it, right? Like to push, right? So you're always thinking that I can do it. I can find the way. I can partner with people. The number of times I made that, like I learned from making mistakes and unfortunately hurting some folks, because like you described, it's like, hey, come and work with me on this project. And then I'm still getting paid a lot of money and I have the support of the institution, you don't, and I'm putting demands on you. And you're coming into the institution and you're trying to do a job and deal with all the other stuff and the baggage. And sadly, like I have to witness that and then hopefully recognize it and then respond, right? That's part of that long journey. And I'm still getting it right. Like I'm still trying to get it right. But what I came to realize is that it's like, I don't think most institutions want to do, like to go the full distance, because the full distance requires a dismantling. You cannot continue to collect.
Yeah.
You cannot continue to operate an institution that, because of its scale, because of its connection to certain models, which are very deeply embedded in capitalist models, you cannot continue to operate that. It always gets in the way, right? The art world, I got involved and went to art school because I thought it was about ideas. I thought it was the place where you could be critically engaged. That's what I thought. I very quickly realized that so much of the art world is just money. It's just spangly, flashy things. And it's not that lots of interesting, strong people are working through that to get things out. But the biggest hurdle is always the transformation of everything into money, right? So, and that's what defines everything, right? So I guess my point is like Camille Turner has done amazing work and raised this issue in their work. Is like the art has a place in other spaces. It has to be public. It has to be truly public and out in the world. It is, the museum and the institutions in academia are a huge barrier and filter.
Yeah.
And so, I'm very conscious of the privilege I had in the past to give me access to a lot of things. But I also made a conscious decision for various reasons, to step out of that and to do the work independently and be independent. And this book, yes, Goose Lane is publishing it, but nobody asked me to write it, right? Like I did the book because I thought, like, this is how I need to navigate the world and do work. And I would not have proceeded with the book if it hadn't been for folks like Camille Turner and Charmaine Nelson and folks like Reagan and many people that appear in the book, Chantal Gibson, going like, this is important work. It's going to be hard. You need to do it. It's tough. Do it. And I would have just, if people said, no, it's not yours, do some research, give it to somebody, I would have been like, okay, sure. right? So,
Next question is from Fazila Jiwa, and it says, congratulations, Andrew.
hi, Fazila. Fazila was my main editor, amazing editor, pushed hard, and also the editor of Policing Black Lives by Robin Maynard, which is a remarkable book.
Well, then her question makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah. She says, I always wondered how, through the inescapable imposition of your own thinking and interpretation, while seeking Sophia's story, you chose to pay attention to the concepts that reoccur throughout the narrative, like the walnut tree and the, what is it, the
allelopathy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even I can't say it.
And black currant, for example. She says there are many.
Yeah.
So I think she has a question about why you chose to connect, that part of nature into the story of Sophia.
I was saying a bit earlier with Taliba about land and landscape and place, and Sophia being a presence, is that I think it's just like that. I believe that there is a presence, there is memory in the world, and it exists in the landscape, in other species, in the trees, in the whatever. It's there, right? And if we only look at it the way Mark Catesby did or Audubon as things to be cataloged, named, documented, we'll not see it. So I'm interested in the black walnut for a tree for a whole bunch of reasons. One is where it grows, one is the wood itself, one is this part of its kind of essence, which can be both nurturing but also a poison. And that they grew. Every time I went looking in a landscape for Sophia, I found those trees. And so I just had to think that's something. There's something in this. If I understand it better, it's a message. And so it comes up in Josiah Henson. So in one chapter, 1851, which is the year that Sophia appears in the census, it's like a major year. It's like Moby Dick. It's the World's Fair. Josiah Henson goes to London, to the Crystal Palace, to the World's Fair. And why is he there? He meets the Queen. He has this amazing comment about seeing the Queen reflected in the mirror that he brought in a black walnut frame. Because the mill that he and many farmer and fugitive and freemen who came north, the mill that was built at the Don settlement, which is really close to where Reagan grew up and her family had come and would have been part of, they were kind of exclusively dealing in black walnut. Mm-hmm. And so when I go with Reagan and I meet her grandparents and the family and we go out to collect nuts in the local park, right? And there's a really strange squirrel there that always chews the nuts exactly the same, so they look like skulls. There's the black walnuts again. Mm-hmm. There's a spot, a very particular place in Dundas at the outlet. It's a spot where I'm quite certain Sophia was when she was deer hunting with Joseph Brant and his kids. And that part of the interview is staggering and it's really striking. In that spot along the canal, there's a grove of black walnut trees that I went down there one day and I was just hanging around because I felt like this is where she is, right? That she's still present, and I collected some nuts. And then I started to realize the trees, the shape of the trees laid out, and I measured it. The dimensions of like the spacing of the trees and the shape and the dimensions are exactly the same as the standard size slave ship. Wow. Right? And so there's this like corridor of trees that move to a point. It's tattooed on my arm now, right? The nuts with the pattern of the trees. And it's like, so I guess to go back, like those are the connections, right? When I write about black currant, it's a connection to my mom. It's a connection to my grandfather and I was going to read a short passage, but I always think I can read more than I can in time. But those things are really important, right? And I think about like now we know from really good research that's been done, particularly on the west coast of Canada, that trees communicate, that there is memory within trees. There are grandmother trees that like reconnect, right? There has to be memory in those spaces. Yeah. So I guess that's why I keep going back into them, it's both to challenge those traditional tellings that come out of like science, Enlightenment science. I mean, people love to talk about the Enlightenment in the West, but slavery is deeply embedded in the Enlightenment, in categorizing and the Industrial Revolution
as well
and
as
all that.
colonialism too,
Yeah.
because a lot of these
They all
schools of
overlap.
thought
Yeah.
are indigenous schools of thought, connecting certain things to
Yeah.
nature and understanding that
Mhm.
generations of things that are in
Yeah.
nature have been speaking through them for
Yeah.
centuries and centuries.
Exactly, yeah. So thanks, and so thank you again hugely for the work you did on the book. And also Alyssa Perez, who was the copy editor of the book, who also contributed a lot in the content of the book. Asked tough questions, yeah.
All right, this question is from Claire Dowie. Again, sorry if I got your name wrong. And she says, I apologize if you've addressed this in the lead up to the launch, but I wonder where the proceeds from this book will go and if this project is a stepping stone or a launch pad for you and your colleagues who have worked with you.
So, how have I addressed it? I've been asked in the past about, somebody asked me like, oh, when the book comes out and it's, will all the money go to charities and things like, and it's like, I'm an independent person. My income is from the work that I do. So whatever money, being a Canadian writer, will go back into continuing to do the work that I do and future work, but the work I do is always in building relationships and connections. What I've tried to do in the process of doing this book is to expand and grow the network and support other people in the work. So yeah, all I can say about like, where does the money go or whatever, I mean, it helps, just continue to support doing the research and doing the work, which and directing resources to other people and sharing those resources. And I think I've gotten better and better knowing when resources that I have access to that I can draw on to support myself in the work. And I also know when it's time to push those resources and let other people take the lead. I don't need to be the person out in front. I really hope like that this book sells well and gets out into the world because I want the story to be read. That's why. Somebody criticized me when they were like, oh, I was doing the sign project, like putting up signs for Sophia around the city. And they're like, oh, you're just doing this to market and sell your book. And it's like, no, I'm doing this to spread the word about her. And if it means people like look in and buy the book and then come out and meet people through the project, well, yeah, I want her story to be told. I don't want to like do some kind of like martyr, thing and write a book about Sophia and then watch it fade. I want it to be read. So I don't know if that's exactly where it was going, but my goal as an independent person is to share. And that's the values that I kind of live by, right? So I hope that's understood. I hope people that I think understand that that's what I'm trying to be and to do. Yeah. That to meet Taliba, to invite Taliba to be here and work together, that takes a lot of trust on Taliba's part to sit here today because we just met, right? Like, and it's so amazing that you showed up. But like I know that my hope is, as happened with Reagan and others in this book and in the journey been on since before, that people see me as genuine and authentic and somebody willing to learn and to be criticized and critiqued, and also use my privilege to stand up and support people. Yeah. So anyways, thanks for that question. Thanks.
Okay. And
I assume we're off.
There's one more
Okay.
question. I was just watching the time.
So okay.
I didn't want to.
I thought
go into another question.
Yeah. Okay.
So this last question is from Melissa Marie Much, and I think it's a good one that I want to hear a little more about. She asks, "What about Joseph Brant as a slave owner?
Sure.
Is this a taboo subject?"
Yeah, it isn't.
Handle it in the book.
Yeah, and that's. I'm glad you bring that up. Do you want to because?
No, because I was actually going to ask you about this earlier, but I think we were a bit pressed for time, so it's great that this was.
I know. I'm glad you brought this up. Yeah, because I mean, obviously, there's a lot in the book to read. We don't talk about everything. I didn't really go into the history of the hats and so on, but this is a really important question, so I'm glad it came up. One of the things that historically has happened with Sophia is the few times that she has surfaced in any kind of writing or talking about slavery is people go to Brant, rightfully they should, because he did own chattels, like he was participant in the system of chattel slavery. But it's almost too often what happens is people will be like, well, indigenous people owned enslaved people too. So like somehow white folks and colonialism wasn't so bad. And so I want to address Brant, and it's hard to talk about because I am, again, a white guy, but Joseph Brant is complicated. He is one of the most complicated parts of the Sophia story because he's indigenous, but he's also highly colonized. Joseph Brant is both fully indigenous, but he's also very British. He is an Anglican, right? He served in the British Army. He's a property owner. Like he is fully participating in the model, the colonial model of success, which is not an indigenous model. Chattel slavery is distinct to European powers who came and colonized, and also chattel slavery is specific to the African diaspora. So there are forms of, in all cultures throughout history, there have been some form of what has been called slavery or servitude, or being held in a kind of bondage that exists within, within many different cultures, including a number of indigenous cultures. But the kind of practice that existed within what some people might say is, Brant's traditional culture as a Mohawk Haudenosaunee, there was lots of examples of people being captured in war, raids, people in my community are killed, we raid another enemy community, we bring people back. That is not chattel slavery. I'm sure it's horrible. Nobody wants to have, to be taken somewhere else. But the opportunity for that person within that worlding, within that place, to be adopted into, to become part of, right, was real. So again, I'm not defending like I want to run off and take people from somewhere else, but it is not chattel slavery. Mm-hmm. And one of the great unfortunate things, which I think has clouded the ability to see Sophia, is that in the past, I think too many people, when they've engaged her or other enslaved people, they've just hopped over her to talk about Joseph Brant or other things to address their issues, right? Or their defensiveness or not wanting to really call out colonial whiteness. When Joseph Brant, whose role model was Johnson, who was kind of the Indian agent, as he was referred to, but basically who ran much of British North America, who lived in the Mohawk Valley and owned at least 60 to 80 enslaved people. He like a role model. He's like the mentor. He was like a father to Brant. Brant very much lives much of his life within that colonized system. And if at the time that he's living and existing in the world, chattel slavery is a huge part of the economy of being a successful person, successful person. Right?
And I also want to say,
sorry, go ahead. I talked too long on that. Yeah.
Firstly, this kind of thing wasn't the norm.
Yeah.
It wasn't the norm.
Yeah.
And also the way that chattel slavery has been historically, as well as implications of colonialism, Indigenous peoples do not benefit from that kind of specific power dynamic presently and in the past, have never benefited from that in the way that whiteness has. So it's really important to note that just because of this specific circumstance doesn't mean that Indigenous people stand to gain anything from this particular instance.
Well, I mean, and if you go back far enough, sorry.
Yeah.
It's okay, Stephanie.
I have to step in. I'm Indigenous.
Stephanie's here.
And if you go back far enough, this would have been the experience of some Indigenous groups themselves as slaves, as the first servants that were captured, right? And so the idea of slavery in the Indigenous languages, the word for what would be a slave, it doesn't mean the same thing that it would mean
it's not
in the
property.
British sense, right?
It's not property.
And there was often pathways to being part of the community. And so I think that that's also really important to note.
I think the biggest thing for me, it is important to understand that Afro-Indigenous solidarity is extremely important, and understanding that Indigenous people are still suffering from
Yeah.
colonial, implications here, as well as are still suffering from being they themselves were also enslaved, as well as chattel slavery has had negative impacts on Indigenous people. So this particular circumstance does not transition into Indigenous people gaining anything from this.
Yeah, and Brant is an individual, right? Which is the
yes.
classic thing, right? Is like whiteness likes to be like, oh, that's just that person. It's not all of us. But immediately turned around and will find an example. It's like, look, Joseph Brant. The other thing I'll just sort of clarify too is like, often if you look in the history and the writing, people talk about how Brant owned like 20 to 30, right? There's no, it sounds funny to be defending number at the same time, right? But it's like, there is no historic evidence for Brant actually owning that many people. He certainly owned people, but that would have been kind of unheard of in this area. There's no real evidence for that. And Sophia says in her own interview, she comments, she talks about the Brant had, she mentions 2 men as slaves. And then she says, I knew of only one other person within the community of Mohawk, what she called it, who owned an enslaved person.
Yeah.
So it's not to say, oh, I don't think he held that many people in bondage. He held people in bondage. He was he aspired to Britishness. And I think that notion of aspiring to whiteness is really important. That's a whole other day's topic.
Yeah, that's something
Yeah.
that's relatively different. But
Yeah.
I also want to say that one of the more present and historically evident pieces of colonialism is that it pits one oppressed group against another.
Yeah.
So this is why it's important
Yeah.
for me to say this about this topic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's really like that is the classic, right? It's like divide, conquer, absorb.
Yeah.
There, if you go back historically in time, there was a period where, if you were Irish, you weren't treated that well by the British here. They carried that anti-Irish sentiment. But then there's a very specific moment around the Civil War where there's a division,
Yes,
right? These
yeah.
allegiances that once existed between a dynamic group of communities all over the United States and into Canada, suddenly it's like, oh, we're going to take, like, we'll absorb you
into
but
our,
you stay out.
yeah.
And that's important. Yeah. And I think just to comment, like I mentioned before about, you were saying that connection between Blackness and indigeneity is really important. I know how important it is to Reagan in the work that Reagan is doing, and the focus that she took on as a student and looking at language and language restoration among Indigenous communities, because, like as she always said, like 8th generation, we've been here. I mean, the community that Reagan is a descendant of, we're here before, as Sophia likes to say, before all the white people came. So that, I have to say, one of the great things I admire about many folks within Black communities and Indigenous communities is the commitment to that relationship. It is absolutely critical, right? And learning a great deal from those relationships.
That was the last question, so we're going to throw it on over to Ben.
Okay,
Bruce Lane.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Do one of these.
Yeah.
Thank you both. And thank you all so much for participating. That was incredibly informative and I think a very necessary reminder of the country that we live in and the things that we all need to do as people, as we move forward. Once again, just want to remind folks that that Andrew's book, It Was Dark There All the Time, will be available at King West Books tomorrow. He is hanging out there from 12 to 4, hopefully not annoying Dave and staff too much while he's over there. You can also order the book at kingwestbooks.com. I'll throw a link into the chat, but thank you once again to Liba, Andrew, Reagan, everyone so much. Stephanie, Sonali, you've all been incredible. And it's been fantastic to work with you all.